Welcome back to another week. This is our last week before half term. Yes, well done. You've completed your first term of remote learning at TTA. So congrats for all of your hard work. I'm very proud of all of you. Today we are going to continue to read The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. As always, any read sections you need to try and read either in your head or even better, read it out loud. Let's get started. Oh, but Switzerland's a beautiful country, said Mother quickly. I haven't ever been there, I admit, but from what I hear. He can't be very old, your father, said Father, his deep voice silencing them all. I mean, you're only what, 17? 18 years old? I've just turned 19, Herr Commandant. So your father would be in his 40s, I expect? Lieutenant Kotler said nothing, but continued to eat, although he didn't appear to be enjoying his food at all. Strange that he chose not to stay in the fatherland, said Father. We're not close, my father and I, said Lieutenant Kotler quickly, looking around the table as if he owed everyone an explanation. Really, we haven't spoken in years. Okay, we're just going to pause for a second. This word here we kind of struggled to say when we were at school. So I want you to try and say it out loud now, if you can, after me. Lieutenant. 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 Okay, let's carry on. And what reason did he give, might I ask, continued Father, for leaving Germany at the moment of her greatest glory and her most vital need, when it is incumbent upon all of us to play our part in the national revival? Was he tubercular? Lieutenant Kotler stared at Father, confused. I beg your pardon? He asked. Did he go to Switzerland to take the air? Explained Father. Or did he have a particular reason for leaving Germany in 1938? He added for a moment. It's important to notice here that 1938 is the year before World War II started. I'm afraid I don't know, Herr Commandant, said Lieutenant Kotler. You would have to ask him. Well, that would be rather difficult to do, wouldn't it? With him being so far away, I mean. But perhaps that was it. Perhaps he was ill. Father hesitated before picking up his knife and fork again and continuing to eat. Or perhaps he had disagreements. Disagreements, Herr Commandant? With government policy. One hears tales of men like this from time to time. Curious fellows, I imagine. Disturbed, some of them. Traitors, others. Cowards, too. Of course, you have informed your superiors of your father's views, Lieutenant Kotler. The young lieutenant opened his mouth and then swallowed, despite the fact he hadn't been eating anything. Never mind, said Father cheerfully. Perhaps it is not appropriate conversation for the dinner table. We could discuss it in more depth at a later time. Herr Commandant, said Lieutenant Kotler, leaning forward anxiously. I can assure you, it is not an appropriate conversation for the dinner table, repeated Father sharply, silencing him immediately, and Bruno looked from one to the other, both enjoying and being frightened by the atmosphere at the same time. I'd love to go to Switzerland, said Gretel, after a lengthy silence. Eat your dinner, Gretel, said Mother. But I was just saying. Eat your dinner, Mother repeated, and was about to say more, but she was interrupted by Father calling for Pavel again. What's the matter with you tonight? He asked, as Pavel uncorked the new bottle. This is the 4th time I've had to ask for more wine. Bruno watched him, hoping he was feeling all right, although he managed to release the cork without any accident. But after he had filled Father's glass and turned to refill Lieutenant Kotler's, he lost his grip of the bottle, somehow, and it fell crashing, glugging its contents out directly onto the young man's lap. Okay, pause, and if you can, read this read section aloud or read it in your head. Okay, let's carry on. His old life in Berlin seemed like a very distant memory now, and he could hardly even remember what Carl, Daniel, or Martin looked like, except for the fact that one of them was ginger. For several weeks after this, Bruno continued to leave the house when Herr List had gone home for the day and Mother was having one of her afternoon naps, and made the long trek along the fence to meet Schmuel, who, almost every afternoon, was waiting there for him, sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the dust beneath him. One afternoon, Schmuel had a black eye, and when Bruno asked him about it, he just shook his head and said that he didn't want to talk about it. Bruno assumed that there were bullies all over the world, not just in schools in Berlin, and that one of them had done this to Shmuel. He felt an urge to help his friend, but he couldn't think of anything he could do to make it better, and he could tell that Shmuel wanted to pretend it had never happened. Every day, Bruno asked Shmuel whether he would be allowed to crawl underneath the wire, so that they could play together on the other side of the fence. But every day, Shmuel said no, it wasn't a good idea. I don't know why you're so anxious to come across here anyway, said Shmuel. It's not very nice. You even tried living in my house, said Bruno. For one thing, it doesn't have 5 floors, only 3. How can anyone live in so small a space as that? He'd forgotten Shmuel's story about the 11 people all living in the same room together before they had come to Outwith, including the boy Luca, who kept hitting him even when he did nothing wrong. One day, Bruno asked why Shmuel and all the other people on that side of the fence wore the same striped pyjamas and cloth caps. That's what they gave us when we got here, explained Shmuel. They took away our other clothes. But don't you ever wake up in the morning and feel like wearing something different? There must be something else in your wardrobe. Shmuel blinked and opened his mouth to say something, but then thought better of it. I don't even like stripes, said Bruno, although this wasn't actually true. In fact, he did like stripes, and he felt increasingly fed up that he had to wear trousers and shirts and ties and shoes that were too tight for him when Shmuel and his friends got to wear striped pyjamas all day long. A few days later, Bruno woke up, and for the first time in weeks it was raining heavily. He had started at some point during the night, and Bruno, even though that it might have woken him up, but it was hard to tell because once he was awake there was no way of knowing how that happened. As he ate his breakfast that morning, the rain continued. Through all the morning classes with her list, the rain continued. While he ate his lunch, the rain continued. And while they finished another session of history and geography in the afternoon, the rain continued. This was bad news, for it meant that he wouldn't be able to leave the house and meet Shmuel. That afternoon, Bruno lay on his bed with a book, but found it hard to concentrate. And just then, the hopeless case came in to see him. She didn't often come to Bruno's room, preferring to arrange and rearrange her collection of dolls constantly during her free time. However, something about the wet weather had put her off her game, and she couldn't face playing it again just yet. What do you want? Asked Bruno. That's a nice welcome, said Gretel. I'm reading, said Bruno. What are you reading? She asked him, and rather than answer, he simply turned the cover towards her so she could see for herself. She made a raspberry sound through her lips, and some of her spit landed on Bruno's face. Boring, she said in a sing-song voice. It's not boring at all, said Bruno. It's an adventure. It's better than dolls, that's for sure. All right, pause the video and read this red section now. Okay, let's carry on. I hate the rain too, he said. I should be with Shmuel by now. He'll think I've forgotten him. The words were out of his mouth quicker than he could stop them, and he felt a pain in his stomach and grew furious with himself for saying that. You should be with who? Asked Gretel. Uh-oh. Let's see what happens. What's that? Asked Bruno, blinking back at her. Who did you say you should be with? She asked again. I'm sorry, said Bruno, trying to think quickly. I didn't quite hear you. Could you say that again? Who did you say you should be with? She shouted, leaning forward so there could be no mistake this time. I never said I should be with anyone, he said. Yes, you did. You said that someone will think you've forgotten them. Pardon? Bruno, she said, in a threatening voice. Are you mad? He asked, trying to make her think that she had entirely made it up. Only he wasn't very convincing, for he wasn't a natural actor like Grandmother, and Gretel shook her head and pointed a finger at him. What did you say, Bruno? She insisted. You said there was someone you should be with. Who was it? Tell me. There's no one around here to play with. Is there? Bruno considered the dilemma he was in. On the one hand, his sister and he had one crucial thing in common. They weren't grown-ups. And although he had never bothered to ask her, there was every chance that she was just as lonely as he was at Outwith. After all, back in Berlin, she had had Hilda and Isabel and Louise to play with. They may have been annoying girls, but at least they were her friends. Here she had no one at all except her collection of lifeless dolls. Who knew how mad Gretel was after all? Perhaps she thought the dolls were talking to her. But at the same time, there was the undeniable fact that Shmuel was his friend and not hers, and he didn't want to share him. There was only one thing for it. That was to lie. I have a new friend, he began. A new friend that I go to see every day, and he'll be waiting for me now. But you can't tell anyone. Why not? Because he's an imaginary friend, said Bruno, trying his best to look embarrassed, just like Lieutenant Kotler had when he had become trapped in his story about his father in Switzerland. We play together every day. Gretel opened her mouth and stared at him before breaking into a laugh. An imaginary friend, she cried. Aren't you a little old for an imaginary friend? Bruno tried to look ashamed and embarrassed in order to make his story more convincing. He squirmed on the bed and didn't look her in the eye, which worked a treat and made him think that perhaps he wasn't such a bad actor after all. He wished that he could make himself go red, but it was difficult to do that, so he thought of embarrassing things that had happened to him over the years and wondered whether these would do the trick. He thought of the time he had forgotten to lock the bathroom door and grandmother had walked in and seen everything. He thought of the time he put his hand up in class and called the teacher mother and everyone had laughed at him. He thought of the time he'd fallen off his bicycle in front of a group of girls when he was trying to do a special trick and cut his knee and cried. One of them worked and his face started to go red. Look at you, said Gretel, confirming it. You've got all red. Because I didn't want to tell you, said Bruno. An imaginary friend. Honestly, Bruno, you're a hopeless case. Bruno smiled because he knew two things. The first was that he had got away with his lie, and the second was that if anyone was the hopeless case around here, it wasn't him. Leave me alone, he said. I want to read my book. Well, why don't you lie down and close your eyes and let your imaginary friend read it to you, said Gretel, delighted with herself now because she had something on him and she wasn't going to let it drop in a hurry. Save you a job. All right, pause and read this section now, please. Okay, let's carry on. How interesting, said Gretel sarcastically, because she had recently had a birthday and turned 13, and thought that sarcasm was the very height of sophistication. And what does he tell you? He tells me about his family and the watch shop that he used to live over, and the adventures he had coming here, and the friends he used to have, and the people he knows here, and about the boys he used to play with. But he doesn't anymore because they disappeared without even saying goodbye to him. He sounds like a barrel of laughs, said Gretel. I wish he was my imaginary friend. And yesterday he told me that his grandfather hasn't been seen for days and no one knows where he is. And whenever he asks his father about him, he starts crying and hugs him so hard that he's worried he's going to squeeze him to death. Bruno got to the end of his sentence and realised that his voice had gone very quiet. These were things that Shmuel had told him, but for some reason he hadn't really understood at the time how sad that must have made his friend. When Bruno said them out loud himself, he felt terrible that he hadn't tried to say anything to cheer Shmuel up, and instead had started talking about something silly, like exploring. I'll say sorry for that tomorrow, he told himself. If Father knew you were talking to imaginary friends, you'd be in for it, said Gretel. I think you should stop. You'd be in for it means that Bruno would get in trouble. Why? Asked Bruno. Because it's not healthy, she said. It's the first sign of madness. Bruno nodded. I don't think I can stop, he said after a very long pause. I don't think I want to. Well, all the same, said Gretel, who was becoming friendlier and friendlier by the second. I'd keep it to myself if I were you. Well, said Bruno, trying to look sad. You're probably right. You won't tell anyone, will you? She shook her head. No one, except my own imaginary friend. Bruno gasped. Do you have one? He asked, picturing her at another part of the fence talking to a girl her own age, the two of them being sarcastic together for hours at a time. No, she said, laughing. I'm 13 years old, for heaven's sake. I can't afford to act like a child, even if you can. And with that, she flounced out of the room, and Bruno could hear her talking to her dolls in the room across the hall, and scolding them for getting themselves into such a mess while her back was turned, that she had no choice but to rearrange them. Did they think she had nothing better to do with her time? Some people, she said loudly, before getting down to work. Bruno tried to return to his book, but he'd lost interest in it for now, and stared out at the rain instead, and wondered whether Shmuel, wherever he was thinking about him too, and missing their conversations as much as he was. Okay, pause the video and read this red section now, please. Okay, let's carry on. Father's birthday was coming up soon, and although he said he didn't want a fuss, Mother arranged a party for all the officers serving at Outwith, and a great fuss was made to prepare for it. Every time she sat down to make more plans for the party, Lieutenant Kotler was there beside her to help, and between them they seemed to make more lists than could ever possibly be needed. Bruno decided to make a list of his own, a list of all the reasons why he didn't like Lieutenant Kotler. There was the fact that he never smiled and always looked as if he was trying to find somebody to cut out of his will. On the rare occasion when he spoke to Bruno, he addressed him as little man, which was just plain nasty, because, as Mother pointed out, he just hadn't had his growth spurt yet. Not to mention the fact he was always in the living room with Mother and making jokes with her, and Mother laughed at his jokes more than she laughed at Father's. Once, when Bruno was watching the camp from his bedroom window, he saw a dog approach the fence and start barking loudly, and when Lieutenant Kotler heard it, he marched right over to the dog and shot it. Then there was all that nonsense that Gretel came out with whenever he was around. And Bruno still hadn't forgotten the evening with Pavel, the waiter who was really a doctor, and how angry the young lieutenant had been. Also, whenever Father was called away to Berlin on an overnight trip, the lieutenant hung around the house as if he were in charge. He would be there when Bruno was going to bed and be back again in the morning before he even woke up. There were a lot more reasons why Bruno didn't like Lieutenant Kotler, but these were the first things that came into his mind. On the afternoon before the birthday party, Bruno was in his room, with the door open when he heard Lieutenant Kotler arriving at the house and speaking to someone, although he couldn't hear anyone answering back. A few minutes later, as he was coming downstairs, he heard Mother giving instructions about what needed to be done, and Lieutenant Kotler saying, "Don't worry, this one's which side his bread is buttered on," and then laughing in a nasty way. Bruno walked towards the living room with a new book Father had given him called Treasure Island, intending to sit in there for an hour or two while he read it. But as he walked through the hallway, he ran into Lieutenant Kotler, who was just leaving the kitchen. "Hello, little man," the soldier said, sneering at him as usual. "Hello," said Bruno, frowning. "What are you up to, then?" Bruno stared at him and started thinking of 7 more reasons to dislike him. "I'm going in there to read my book," he said, pointing towards the living room. Without a word, Kotler whipped the book out of Bruno's hand and started to flick through it. "Treasure Island," he said. "What's it about, then?" "Well, there's an island," said Bruno slowly, to make sure that the soldier could keep up. "And there's treasure on it." "I could have guessed that," said Kotler, looking at him as if there were things he would do to the boy if he were a son of his and not the son of the commandant. "Tell me something I don't know about it." "There's a pirate in it," said Bruno, "called Long John Silver, and a boy called Jim Hawkins." "An English boy?" asked Kotler. "Yes," said Bruno. Grunted Kotler. Bruno stared at him and wondered how long it would be before he gave back his book. He didn't seem particularly interested in it, but when Bruno reached for it, he pulled it away. "Sorry," he said, holding it out again, and when Bruno reached for it, he pulled it away for the second time. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he repeated, and held it out once more, and this time Bruno swiped it out of his hand quicker than he could pull it away. "Aren't you quick?" muttered Lieutenant Kotler between his teeth. Bruno tried to step past him, but for some reason Lieutenant Kotler seemed to want to talk to him today. "All set for the party, are we?" he asked. "Well, I am," said Bruno, who had been spending more time with Gretel lately and had developed a liking for sarcasm. "Can't speak for you." Okay, pause the video and read this red section now, please. Okay, let's carry on. "Oh, Kurt, precious, you're still here," said Mother, stepping out of the kitchen and coming towards them. "I have a little free time now if—" "Oh," she said, noticing Bruno standing there. "Bruno, what are you doing here?" "I was going into the living room to read my book," said Bruno, "or I was trying to at least." "Well, run along into the kitchen for the moment," she said. "I need a private word with Lieutenant Kotler." And they stepped into the living room together as Lieutenant Kotler closed the door in Bruno's face. Seething with anger, Bruno went into the kitchen and got the biggest surprise of his life. There, sitting at the table, a long way from the other side of the fence, was Shmuel. Bruno could barely believe his eyes. "Shmuel!" He looked up. "What are you doing here?" Shmuel looked up, and his terrified face broke into a broad smile when he saw his friend standing there. "Bruno!" he said. "What are you doing here?" repeated Bruno. For although he still didn't quite understand what took place on the other side of the fence, there was something about the people from there that made him think they shouldn't be here in his house. "He brought me," said Shmuel. "He?" asked Bruno. "You don't mean Lieutenant Kotler?" "Yes. He said there was a job for me to do here." And when Bruno looked down, he saw 64 small glasses, the ones Mother used when she was having one of her medicinal sherries, sitting on the kitchen table, and beside them a bowl of warm soapy water and lots of paper napkins. "What on earth are you doing?" asked Bruno. "They asked me to polish the glasses," said Schmuel. "They said they needed someone with tiny fingers." As if to prove something that Bruno already knew, he held his hand out, and Bruno couldn't help but notice that it was like the hand of the pretend skeleton that Herr List had brought with him one day when they were studying human anatomy. "I'd never noticed before," he said, in a disbelieving voice, almost to himself. "Never noticed what?" asked Schmuel. In reply, Bruno held his own hand out so that the tips of the middle fingers were almost touching. "Our hands," he said. "They're so different. Look!" The two boys looked down at the same time, and the difference was easy to see. Although Bruno was small for his age, and certainly not fat, his hand appeared healthy and full of life. The veins weren't visible through the skin. The fingers weren't little more than dying twigs. Schmuel's hand, however, told a very different story. "How did it get like that?" he asked. Okay, pause the video and read this red section now, please. Okay, let's carry on. "He told me not to move from this seat or there'd be trouble." "I wouldn't mind him," said Bruno, trying to sound braver than he really was. "This isn't his house, it's mine, and when Father's away, I'm in charge. Can you believe he's never even read Treasure Island?" Schmuel looked as if he wasn't really listening. Instead, his eyes were focused on the slices of chicken and stuffing that Bruno was throwing casually into his mouth. After a moment, Bruno realised what he was looking at and immediately felt guilty. "I'm sorry, Schmuel," he said quickly. "I should have given you some chicken too. Are you hungry?" "That's a question you never have to ask me," said Schmuel, who, although he had never met Gretel in his life, knew something about sarcasm too. "Wait there, I'll cut some off for you," said Bruno, opening the fridge and cutting another 3 healthy slices. "No, if he comes back," said Schmuel, shaking his head quickly and looking back and forth towards the door. "If who comes back? You don't mean Lieutenant Kotler?" "I'm just supposed to be cleaning the glasses," he said, looking at the bowl of water in front of him in despair, and then looking back at the slices of chicken that Bruno held out to him. "He's not going to mind," said Bruno, who was confused by how anxious Schmuel seemed. "It's only food." "I can't," said Schmuel, shaking his head, and looking as if he was going to cry. "He'll come back. I know he will," he continued, his sentences running quickly together. "I should have eaten them when you offered them. Now it's too late. If I take them, he'll come in, and—" All right, we're going to stop there. Now you need to go to show my homework and complete the quiz titled English, Monday, the 8th of February. That is your submission for the lesson today, and I will see you in tomorrow's video.